So we're going to talk about innovation and what I call here value creation, the ultimate competitive advantage. And you folks have been doing a tremendous job at continuous innovation. So it's fun, again, to be here and talk about this. So I used to work for RCA and then GE, and then I became part of SRI, and I became the CEO, which had been failing for 20 years. It was about to go bankrupt. The buildings were falling down, and pretty much everybody hated each other because that's what's happening when you're not succeeding. And as I just said, we won 2 Emmys for high definition television. We did Siri, that's now on the iPhone. Intuitive Surgical, that's $80 billion company, and Nuance, which is the leading speech company, it's about 4 or 5 billion. And on the way, we grew the core business of SRI, which is basically innovative services and technologies for companies. We grew it 2.5 times. If you're interested, I wrote a book about it. It was a top 10 Business Week book. And I recently had a Harvard Business Review article come out called Innovation for Impact. So lots of background information about what we're going to do. So just to start off with a few questions. Does everybody on this telecast believe you're a value creator? Is everybody a value creator? Now, normally I'd be able to see the hands. I can't right now. But that's the question I always ask. And the second is, do you have shared language for value creation? Do you have a way to communicate effectively? And the third is, do you have a systematic process for developing both incremental and new transformational innovations? And clearly, you have to do both. So here's Peter Drucker. You probably all know him. He's considered to be the father of modern management. And here's one of his most famous quotes. Because the purpose of business is to create a customer, the business enterprise has 2 and only 2 basic functions, marketing and innovation. All the rest are costs. Marketing and innovation, that's what we're going to talk about. And this is the job of everybody in the company because everybody has a customer. If you have a customer, whether inside or outside, obviously your job is to continuously be creating and delivering new value to them. So then the question is, well, how are we doing? It turns out that the lifetime of big companies, S&P 500, has been declining from about 70 years, let's say 100 years ago, to 15 years now. And it's continuing, it seems to be continuing to go down. The world really is more competitive. And we've done workshops with about 700 teams. And remarkably enough, only about 25% of what they work on would have any value if they completed it. And we don't decide that. We just give them a framework, and you'll see some of that for how to evaluate what they're doing. In one big top 10 company, we went through the workshop, nothing they were working on would have any value for the company. Okay, so I think we can do better. So what is value creation and innovation? So some say that failing fast is the key to success. Well, we get the idea that we have to do lots of experiments and try things. But really, the key to success is how do you learn and improve faster than your competition? It's about learning and improving faster than the competition. And when you think of it that way, all kinds of things fall in place that you should do to help you do that, to learn faster. So today we're going to talk about 3 ideas. Work on important opportunities because if you don't, obviously you're not going to make an important impact. Have a common language and concepts for value creation because you need to be able to communicate effectively and efficiently inside the enterprise. And the third is you need to learn rapidly. You need a way to learn properly because almost everything you folks do is interdisciplinary. It takes disciplines from many different directions, and somehow the job is like, a recipe. You've got to bring all those ingredients together to create the kind of advanced products you want for your customers. And the things I'm going to talk about today don't require any kinds of reorganizations. It doesn't take money, it doesn't take anything. It's just a way of working and thinking. And these ideas can be used you individually or in your teams or across your enterprise. So I hope there's a take-home message here for everybody. Now, you probably heard this quote, build a better mousetrap and the world will be a path to their door. Well, there have been about 6,000 mousetrap patents. And as it turns out, there's only about a dozen that actually are used. And this is still the classic one that sells the most. So what are those other almost 6,000 mousetrap patents? Are they innovations? No. They're inventions. They're not innovations. People have to use your ideas before they become innovations. So that leads to three critical definitions. Invention, you folks invent a lot. A novel idea reduced to practice. Value creation is solving an important customer and marketplace problem better than any alternative. For Siri, that turned out to be advanced in the semantic web. How do you connect different objects so you can make sense out of when you make a query into your iPhone app? And innovation is the delivery of new customer value into the marketplace with a sustainable business model. Now, I've asked thousands of senior executives to give their definition for innovation. And so far, only 2 people have actually mentioned the business model, which is kind of an amazing thing. And I look at hundreds of new ventures all the time, and oftentimes people say, we'll develop the business model later. Well, that's not a good strategy. You want everybody to be thinking about the business model at the same time they're thinking about a possible new offering. Because, among other things, you don't make money, it's not going to work. But also, the innovations in business models is one of the most active areas where you can contribute today. Okay, so innovation takes many forms. You know that. You make many different kinds of products for many different kinds of customers. But here's one little tip that I always look for. I don't know what you folks thought when you saw a ketchup bottle turned upside down, but I went, whoa, that's curious. And then, of course, I immediately said, wow, that solves a real problem of pounding on the end of the ketchup bottle and, spilling it all over the table, or maybe your buddy who's sitting next to you. And that's a principle of all important innovations. They're surprising. If you're not at least a little surprised, it's probably not something of significance. All important innovations are surprising at first. Of course, then you adapt to it. We all adapt to ketchup bottles upside down, and then you have to do it again. That's our business. Surprise people, they adapt, then we have to surprise them again. So that leads to what's the definition for value? That's another interesting question. Value equals customer benefits over customer costs. And as you know, benefits come in many different forms. I'm going to give some examples in a moment, but so do costs. If you buy a car, it's not just the price, it's the insurance, it's the gas, it's where the maintenance shop is. There's just a whole bucket of things that come together. And remarkably enough, there are still people who like keypads over touch screens, which is fine because only the customer determines our value. Benefits and costs are only as perceived by the customer. So what we think is important, but our customers really are who we work for. So what are different forms of value? Well, there are commodities, like wheat or really basic things, sand to make silicon, products, services, experiences, and emotions or higher meaning. And we all know about Nokia. They created really solid, good products. But then Steve Jobs came along with the iPhone, but then he had things like iTunes, and then he had Siri for experiences, and he branded his products as being special. You were really clever if you bought Apple products, and you weren't so clever if you bought the other folks. And while he was alive, he created the most valuable company in the world. And at the same time, in 7 years, he put Nokia out of business. Nokia had everything. They had great people. They had tons of money. They had a supply chain that was not to be beaten. But they missed one thing, the ability to innovate at the speed of the market. And Steve Jobs, and 7 years later, the company as we knew it then was gone. So it doesn't have to be new expensive things. There are opportunities for innovation everywhere. So this is an MRI machine. And, when a child would come in to have an MRI, they would often be terrified by this machine and the noise it made. So a GE engineer said, well, why don't we turn it into a rocket ship? And when the kids come in, we'll tell them that when they hear that noise, it's the rocket engines blasting them off to the moon. Well, who did this create value for? Certainly for the child, certainly for the parents, for the nurses, for the technicians, for the doctors, and of course for the hospital, because now they can use a machine where they might be losing 2 hours because some child is acting up. They now can continuously use the machine. So here, for a $1,000 paint job, we're creating millions of dollars of new value and value for all the stakeholders involved. Okay, now what's the definition of the value proposition? And I think this is the most important idea I'm going to tell you today, and it's the thing that I think can make the biggest difference. I don't know if you have a definition for a value proposition. Very few companies do, at least one that's consistent and concise. It's a description of the customer's need to be addressed, how you plan on achieving it, addressing it, why your solution will be valuable to customers, and why it's going to be a lot better than the competition and the alternatives. And to be useful, effective value propositions have to be compelling and easy to remember. If people can't remember them, they can't repeat it to your customers, they can't repeat it to the team, your partners. It's got to be in a form where everybody can remember it and repeat it. So we've tried dozens of different variations of value propositions, and we found most of them were not effective, and we finally settled on this definition. We think it has 4 parts. What's the customer need? We've got to start with the need, that's obvious. What's your approach for the offering and the business model? What are the benefits per cost? And how does that compare to the competition? So we start everything off with just these 4 questions, and we call it an NABC. So here's our objective. We want to address an important customer and market need with a new, compelling, and defensible approach for the offering and business model, with superior benefits per cost, both for the customer and for the enterprise, when compared to the competition and the alternatives. 4 questions. Now, what I'd like to ask you at this point is, do you have to answer these 4 questions for everything you do in the company? Do you always have to know who the customer is? Do you always have to have a compelling approach? Do you always need to be able to articulate the benefits per cost? And is your goal always to beat the competition? I would argue you have to answer all 4 of these questions for just about everything you do, not only in your business, but in your life. When you buy a car, you ask yourself, what's the need? What are all the different approaches? Which one gives me the superior benefits per cost, and which one is the competition? And just having an organization where everybody thinks this way and starts every business discussion off with the customer's need is by itself transformative. And very few companies have that kind of mindset where everyone, you're guaranteed that everyone in the company is customer focused because every discussion starts out with the customer. Now, unfortunately, this is what we see. Most of the presentations we see, I say 95% here, sometimes I feel like it's 100%. They're all about the person's idea. They're in love with their idea. They want to tell you about their idea for hours. They always assume the need is obvious, the benefits per cost are obvious, there's no competition. That's what it always sounds like. And I've listened to thousands and thousands of those. And that's not what we want to do. As business folks trying to grow really fast and rapidly like you are, people need to answer at least these 4 questions when they get started. So we don't want to do that. And one of our basic rules is if you can't describe your value proposition, you don't yet know what you're doing and where you're going. These are the basic questions. They set the template for the direction you're going to go off when you start spending real money and start solving the problem. And if the fundamental questions are not answered concisely and correctly, then you're probably going in the wrong direction. And again, we see this over and over and over again. People fall in love with their idea, they build up a team, they spend a lot of money, and they crash and burn, and everybody feels bad. It's not a good approach. So while you're doing this, you have to bring it to life. You have to make it vivid. So words like bigger, better, faster, cheaper are not allowed. Bigger than what? Bigger than a bus, or bigger than a toaster? Who knows? You got to say. And if you're not sure, you give a range. You put down your best guess, and you can then go back and you can verify. Do some homework and put boundaries on what you're thinking about. And of course, use figures, graphs, mock-ups, anything you can to communicate your idea effectively. So here's an idea. A bad picture is usually better than a good description. So that was me. I drew that picture. That's a segue. But imagine trying with words to describe a Segway and how much more effective even that terrible, terrible, terrible picture is than trying to describe it. So just those are some tips. Okay, next, what are important customer needs? Well, obviously it depends on what area you're in, but just as some general guidance. So look at this Venn diagram. You've got customers and they have needs. That's what the N stands for. You have capabilities, both inside and with your partners. That's what's going to make your approach. And of course, there's the competition. So we would then ask you, where do you want to be? You want to be in 1, 2, 3, or 4. Well, 1 doesn't make sense. Customers and you can't do anything there. 2 doesn't make sense because that's where there's no need and the competition's there. So most people settle in on 3 or 4. And I would ask you, pick one. Pick one where you think you want to be, 3 or 4. Typically about a third of the people say 3 and 2/3 say 4. And we want to be in 4 too. And we call that the white space. It's a new area of business where there's always competition, but the competition is not as compelling as in 3, number 1, or we have something really special. And within that, there needs to be what we call a beachhead, a place where you can get started with friendly customers, even if the product isn't perfect. And those are where we have the superior benefits per cost of value for those starting customers. And you often know these people by name, because you're working with them as part of the innovation process. Okay, with that in place, we ask a series of really basic questions. Well, first, who is the customer? What's their problem? What is their actual need? They probably can't tell you their actual need because they don't know what's possible, so you have to figure that out. Why hasn't it been solved? And what is your compelling solution? So really basic questions. So here are some guidance we used at SRI. We wanted to be in growing white spaces with beachheads. We had metrics for that, so if it was a venture, it had to be at least 100 million. Otherwise, it didn't make sense for us, and we couldn't recruit the best people. We wanted to be 2 to 10 times better. A defensible solution, a business model, the customer really cares. As people say, a painkiller, not just a vitamin. It's a really high priority for those beachhead folks. They really want to get the problem solved. And you really care because this is really hard work. And oftentimes it takes years to really, work this out. So you have to really care about it. So here's the classic example. People talk about known and unknown needs. And, in most of the presentations we see, there are certainly unknown needs, unknown to the customer, that is. So, Nokia was the #1 company in the world in just 13 years ago. And Steve Jobs came along with the touchscreen. And what did he see that they didn't see? He saw that those little keypads, you could never have enough of them. They were inconvenient. It just was a terrible way to interact with the device. And what people really wanted was more convenience and functionality. So that was his key insight into the actual need. It wasn't the keypads. And the key insight into the solution was the touch screen. Just those 2 things. If those 2 things were valid, he was off to the races. Now, he actually didn't survey customers very much or at all. And of course, there were lots of surveys done at the time, and they all said what people wanted was better keyboards. They didn't know that a touchscreen was possible. And so Steve Jobs actually identified the actual need, which was convenience and functionality, and came up with a solution for the thing that was preventing the solution, which was the programmable interface. Here's another example from SRI. This young girl has multiple sclerosis, and I would ask you if she were your daughter, would you be happy with that solution? I suspect you'd say absolutely not. So what's the actual need? Well, there needs to be some kind of conformable augmentation that is easy to put on and functioning. So in Japan, they've been doing a lot of work on robots, and so they basically strap that robot onto a person. It weighs 20 pounds, it lasts for 2 hours. Would you put that on your young daughter? I doubt it. Would you put that on your 85-year-old grandmother? I doubt it. It's not a solution. So why hasn't it been solved? It hasn't been solved because how do you attach the robot to the body? So we weren't spending a lot of money, but we were trying to figure that out. And finally, one of our people said, what about a Chinese puzzle? You know, you stick your finger in, it grabs, and you pull it out. You push it in the right way, you can pull it back out. He said, why don't we put a Chinese puzzle on each thigh of the body? We can have sensors. And so when you move forward, it'll grab onto the appropriate leg, and then you'll push down, and it'll basically help the body move forward. And then the other leg will move, and it'll grab, and the first one will ungrab. And so they'll alternate back and forth, and we can use that as a way to attach to the body. And that led to this prototype, wearable pants. So those pants you can wear for over 8 hours. You can put them on as a pair of pants. It's obviously kind of a clunky solution because it's techies made that. The final version of that, well, you probably have to notice twice to tell that it actually is a gizmo that you put on that's not a normal pair of pants. But that's not the beachhead. That's actually a hard market to enter. So where we're entering first is with back pain, a problem that half the population is going to have. And that's the company was just selected as one of the most promising new companies last year. So this is the kind of thought process we went through. And I'm going to say a bunch of times, when we were doing this, we were not spending much money. That was part of our success. We'd spent very little money until we had a good working hypothesis. So we're always trying to develop something that we had that other people didn't have. We call that the golden nugget. It comes from your key insights. So the key insight for that young lady was the Chinese puzzle. So we obviously patented that upside down and backwards. A key technology, process, capability, something that's superior to the competition. You own it, of course. And it's your wow factor. It's what makes you special and why customers must have your offering and your competitive advantage and barrier to entry. So nothing unusual here, but everyone at SRI, after a while, got to understand this is what we're after. And these key insights were how we identified it. So this is a bit of a joke, but we hear this all the time. These are not golden nuggets. We hear presentations all the time say, we have a great toolbox of capabilities. Well, swell, so does everybody else. Carpenters have a great toolbox, but the goal is to build something. Working hard. Everybody works hard today. I'm sure everybody here works really hard. These are necessary, but that's not what we're talking about. These are not golden nuggets. We're talking about really achieving something. So another thing is, of course, risk mitigation. What does risk do to value? Well, value goes up as risk goes down. So in the beginning, anything that's of significance has risk to it. And so you want to get rid of that, or at least mitigate it to the extent you can. Is it the customer need? Again, very few times do people actually identify the customer need. It's not that they're wrong, it's just usually at 20,000 feet. And it has to go through iteration after iteration after iteration to finally articulate what the real customer need is. Again, in those 700 teams, no one has been able to really articulate the customer need the first time when they presented. What's your solution? What are the technical problems? Do you have a good sustainability model or business model? And is it the right time? And do you have real proof points? Do you have evidence that you can solve that technical problem? Do you have commitment from your partners? Do you have skin in the game from them so you know they're really committed to your success? So we ask everybody, our teams, to list the risk and impact of their critical assumptions, just a little diagram like this or whatever's convenient. Where's the risk? And if the risk is high and the impact is high, then that's what we focused on first. When you do a new project, there's usually 100 things you can do easily out of the box. They're just things that, if you just apply some time and some muscle, you can do them. That's not a good way to go forward. Now, what you want to do is eliminate the biggest potential impact first, work with urgency, work fast, and don't spend money. Spend your money on eliminating your risk, not on things you can do. Because until you've eliminated the risk, it doesn't make sense to build that prototype. I think the idea of a minimum viable product in some ways has made things worse because everybody wants to go build their gizmo before they actually have a compelling value proposition and they've taken the big risks out of their idea. When you start building things, the team gets to be too big, they become too committed, and you're probably not right until you really, again, can address the value proposition. Here's a quick example. A team came in to see me one day and they said, Curt, the copper wires on substrates have to keep on getting thinner. There's a kind of Moore's law for that. And we need to get down to 1 micron or even less in some cases. And today, often the lines are produced by putting down some material and then subtracting away all the rest of the copper on the substrate. So we've developed an additive technology where we can print whatever design we want on the circuit board. So I said, well, how does it work? And they said, well, we're going to put down this ink and it's got palladium in it, and the palladium is going to stick to the substrate underneath, which is polyimide, and then we'll electroplate the copper on top of it. I said, okay, swell. I'm not worried about the copper and the palladium. I know that chemical bond is going to work, but why is the palladium going to stick to the polyimide? They said, well, van der Waals force. Now, if some of you know this, van der Waals force is not a strong force. This is what saran wrap sticks together with. And I said, no, I don't think that's going to work. Go tell me why it's going to work. So they went away for a week, and finally a couple of chemists came in and they explained to me the chemistry and the physics of the bonding between the polyimide and the palladium. And one of them said, Curt, this is going to stick so well, you'll have to sandpaper this stuff off the substrate. Okay. So I spent no money. Am I feeling better at this point? Yep. So I gave them $1,000. By the way, they came in, they wanted several $100,000 because they wanted to build the first system. I said, I don't think so. So I gave them $1,000 and said, create a prototype and show me what the lines look like. So this is an electron microscope, so the image is inverted. But those are 3 micron copper lines, and they look pretty good. So okay, so I'm feeling better. We can make thin lines, and at least I have a logical argument for why they might stick. So then we did the big test. This was the expensive one. We bought some duct tape, and we put it on top of that substrate and pulled it off to see if the copper lines would stick. And sure enough, boy, did they stick. The copper bonded to the substrate. The substrate is what fell apart, not the bond between the substrate and the copper lines. So the guy who told me that we'd have to sandpaper this off was absolutely correct. We would have to sandpaper it off. It really does stick. So this was the kind of process we always went through. We're spending as little money as we can, and we've continued this. Now it's become a company. As we would develop these innovations. So we could be developing, 12 or 15 relatively significant things all at once without betting the farm on spending a lot of money on any of them. We often ask people to create what we call an action pitch. So a hook on the NABC, the core, and then an action, because you're not giving these presentations for the fun of it. You want something to happen. So the hook is just to gain people's interest. I gave a hook earlier. I said less than a quarter of company innovation initiatives have any value. Whoa, less than a quarter? That doesn't sound very good. Then NABC, and then what do you want to happen next? Because you always want something to happen. You're not just giving the presentation for the fun of it. You want something to happen. So you got to practice. It may seem pretty straightforward to answer these 4 questions on ABC. It's not. Typically, it takes people dozens, if not hundreds of times to answer just those 4 questions. Not so easy. Enthusiasm is essential. If you're not enthusiastic, why should anybody else be? Be quantitative. We already talked about that. Mock-ups, pictures, stories, data, whatever you can do. You got to bring it to life. They've got to be able to remember what you're doing and be able to communicate that to their partners and to your customers and to the management. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is learning fast. So you may have an incubation process inside of the company, and we tried everything you could imagine, and we finally came up with this strategy for that. At SRI, every 2 to 4 weeks, and with the partners that we work with today, same thing. Every 2 to 4 weeks, 3 to 6 teams of 3 to 5 people would come in and give their 3 to 10 minute NABC value proposition. So just mostly 5-minute talks. That's usually enough to communicate the fundamentals. And after the person would give their presentation, they'd be quiet. They'd listen to the feedback. No arguing. Arguing sets up an adversarial environment. That's not helpful. This is all about improvement. It's not about trying to, say who's smarter. None of that kind of stuff. And what we discovered is this particular format was surprisingly productive. Surprisingly productive. It's not like giving somebody feedback one-on-one. This form of team feedback turns out to be really remarkable. And the comparison I make is a little bit to an eye test. Doctors don't just give you a new pair of glasses to put on. That wouldn't work. They say, Curt, is this better? And you go, well, I don't know. And then they say, well, try this one. Well, I'm not sure. And they say, what about the first one again? You'd be in the doctor's office all day. Rather, what they have is a device that just goes A, B, which one's better, and in 15 minutes, you've got a terrific prescription for each eye with astigmatism and all the rest of it. That's what basically happens in these meetings. The team will get up, they'll give their NABC. It's probably not good, it's never good the first time. Then somebody else gives theirs. But each time, there'll be 4 or 5 of these or 6 of these in a session. And inevitably, somebody will be doing good things on some part of the value proposition. They'll begin to understand better the need and how to partition it and how to segment it and how to quantify it or the approach with different business models. So it's an opportunity to learn and compare one to the other. So it really is comparative learning. And this way of getting feedback and learning in a positive environment really is kind of magical. As one of my friends said, it looks like magic, but it's not luck. It's not luck. So again, what we ask in these sessions is as a facilitator, and they say, what's good? Don't forget that. That was really good. Here's some ideas to improve. Here's the eyes of the customer and eyes of the investor. And the team would take notes. And a completely positive meeting, no negatives. That's not what we do. It's not about, that kind of crazy stuff that goes on in a lot of companies. It's all about how do we improve fast. And this is one of the major reasons why we were able to, for example, with Siri, we beat IBM by 5 years. Imagine that. We got a company with 2,500 people, and we beat them, with endless amounts of talent and money and opportunities and partners. And why is it? Well, because we had to pull all those technologies together, and they don't have a way to do that. So as I mentioned, it's a very positive process. We ask people to be positive, supportive, respectful, build on what was presented, be crisp to the point, add to the feedback. When you're taking, it's active listening. We want you to stand and be open and listen. Don't respond. Have teammates take notes and be thankful. It's a gift. And the premise here is that everything you do and everything we did is, again, multidisciplinary. And somehow you've got to get the people in the room with the points of view to be able to add those ideas, to be able to create those innovations fast enough with all those different perspectives. Most companies don't have a way to do that. That's why we beat IBM by so much. So the feedback is actually a gift. So, okay, putting this all together, obviously NABC is not the whole story. It's the beginning. It sets your direction. I've given you some, high-level, quick insight into some of the more fundamental things, the white space, beachhead, key insights, business model, risk reduction. We were going into more detail in these things, team formation. And of course, eventually it had to turn into a business plan, sales, marketing, service, distribution, all that kind of stuff. So we had to do all these things. But a lot of people, they start with the business plan and then work backwards. A popular way right now is the business model canvas. We never used that. We thought that was actually not a good idea. You don't start at the end, you start at the beginning. So you don't start at the end and then go back. What you do is you start with the fundamentals, and then you work your way forward. And because every business plan we did was different customers, different markets. Was it a license? Was it a product for somebody else? Was it a new venture we were going to form? The end plans were always somewhat different. So we started with the fundamentals, then we worked our way forward, and then we created the business plan that made sense for that innovation. And that, by the way, again, this is all about going faster and reducing the cost of doing these things enormously. So you know about Siri. We worked on that for a year. We did a lot of research on that, and we incubated it the way I just described. We eventually put all the pieces together with a good working hypothesis. We hired that team. That's an amazing team, by the way. I think it's the best team. When we formed it, it was the best team in the world, certainly for this. And we incubated that for another year, again, without spending much money until we took more risk out of the value proposition. And only then did we build the final prototype, the minimum viable product, if you will, after we'd taken up much of the risk out. And 2 weeks after the product was launched, Steve Jobs showed up, and he called our CEO, who's in the middle of that picture, and he said, Doug, this is Steve Jobs. And our CEO said, no, it's not. And he hung up the phone. And the phone rang again. He said, no, this really is Steve Jobs. I want to come over and talk to you guys. So that's what happened. And we didn't want to sell it. So we were calling up all the other big companies in our space. And we got the normal stories of, you can't do that. Nobody can do that. Nobody wants that. We can do that. Don't worry about it. Blah, blah, blah. And there's Steve Jobs sitting in the lobby making offers to buy the company. When he bought it and he put it on his platform, we made a lot of money from that, but he made a really lot of money. It added over $50 billion to the value of Apple stock by him putting Siri on. Can you imagine? And all these other VPs who were not doing their homework like Steve Jobs were telling us it didn't have any value. And the last point here is that all this time, the framework we're using is still NABC, concise, fundamentals, a formulation where you can communicate with everybody. And eventually, as the team got built, each team had its own value proposition for how it was contributing to the overall mission of Siri. And so, again, about speed, efficiency, conciseness, a shared language, all of those things in place. So when you start, our assumption is you don't know anything. Actually, you know quite a bit. Unfortunately, you probably know a lot of things that are also wrong. So net, assume you know nothing when you start. Most people focus on what we call interesting problems. And when you get there, it probably doesn't matter. We've tried to focus on things of significance. We would have an initial target. And then we would use our value creation process to rapidly try and get to a point where we had a pretty good solution. And because when we start, you don't know very much, but what we did discover, if we followed our process as I described it, we almost always ended up in a good place. So Siri, by the way, we've done, I think, 3, maybe 4, one's in process. 3 other ventures based on that same technology because it was an important opportunity. Personal assistance is obviously a big deal if we could solve that problem. So today we've talked about 3 things: important customer needs, because if you don't work on things that are important, you're not going to make an important contribution. So having metrics for what that means. We had our metrics. I hope everybody knows the metrics in the company. A shared language, so you can talk and conceive of what solutions look like very fast and efficiently. And I think the most important idea is NABC value propositions. That one idea is transformative because it immediately forces everybody to start with the need, not just their idea. So need comes before idea, or it goes back and forth. But if you don't have the need part, it doesn't make any sense. And a way to learn fast that's efficiently and effective. So at SRI, we'd have these meetings every 2 weeks over lunch with pizza and Coke. It was the steady cadence of them that eventually got people to understand these concepts and a whole lot more, by the way. I mean, after you've been doing this for 3 years, you've got a pretty good education and value creation. And if you're interested in more material, I mentioned the publications we have. We have a program on Coursera from Northeastern University. It's called Value Creation, the Carlson and Polizzotto method. It's an hour and a half, which basically goes through all this with demonstrations of the concepts that we're talking about today. And so with that, I guess it's time for a discussion. And I would just mention finally that I put on the LinkedIn every week what I call Curt's Value Creation Tip of the Week. So I go into some other part of this because you can't do a whole lot, obviously, in a short presentation like this.